All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ken McDonald. I'm the Chief of the Wildlife Division with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and a member of the Montana Transportation and Wildlife Partnership group. And I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on the project program. We'll talk about that a little bit here. A couple of logistics before we get started is we didn't require any kind of registration. So if you see at the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a little box for it's Q&A, it's called. If you can enter your name, your affiliation, if you have one, and email in that, that'll just give us a record of who's on the webinar. And then we're also going to use that same button if you have questions throughout the presentation. So if you have a question that comes up while you're listening to the presenters, if you'll enter the question in that Q&A box when we're done with the presentations, we'll have moderators give those questions to the right presenter and try and get your answers. And then you can use that throughout the presentation. So that's it for the logistics. So today's webinar is focused on describing the Wildlife Transportation Project Program, which is a standardized and collaborative framework for receiving and evaluating wildlife transportation accommodation project proposals, which will help reduce wildlife vehicle conflicts, improve safe wildlife passage across Montana's highways, and hopefully see some of those proposals come to fruition. The project program has been in development by the Montana Transportation Wildlife Partnership for a couple years and was just recently launched. A little bit of the background, how we got to this point, and if you're on our webinar the other day, this will be redundant, but still interesting. So in December of 2018, the Montana Governor's Office, the Montana Department of Transportation, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, the Western Transportation Institute, and a coalition of non-government organizations and citizen advocates called Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage jointly hosted the first ever Montana Wildlife and Transportation Summit. The summit was convened to bring stakeholders together to strengthen working relationships, to share information, and to develop strategies to plan and implement wildlife accommodations associated with transportation systems, to also reduce animal vehicle collisions and protect wildlife and their movement across state highways. An outcome of that summit was an MOU signed by the Department of Transportation and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to help ensure that the agencies continue working together on wildlife and transportation issues, regardless who's in office. Another outcome of the summit was an agreement by the Montana Department of Transportation, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage to work together to implement recommendations that came out of the summit. This has resulted in Department of Transportation, FWP, and Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage forming a collaborative Montana Wildlife Transportation Partnership. This partnership consists of a steering committee that's comprised of 2 representatives from each of the 3 organizations that are in leadership capacities. It also includes a planning and implementation team known as the PIT crew, and they do a lot of the behind the scenes work directed by the steering committee. And then we have a data and implementation work group comprised of research, data, and GIS specialists that help develop a planning tool that we discussed in a webinar last Monday. Our recommendation from the summit and the partnership was to bring public and private partnerships together with the ability to propose and develop wildlife accommodation projects that support wildlife connectivity. In other words, the direction was to do something rather than just talk about it. So the planning tool and this effort we're going to talk about today are those outcomes of doing something. The partnership has developed a project program that does do something. The project program enables government and non-government organizations, ideally working together, to propose projects to address wildlife transportation issues based on needs of wildlife or to help address a wildlife transportation safety issues, such as places where we have wildlife collisions. The project program is the framework that brings public-private partnerships together, and through this program, groups can propose and develop accommodation projects that support wildlife connectivity. The unique thing about this is that projects can be standalone for the specific purposes of wildlife accommodation, rather than having to be incorporated into an existing planned highway project. This provides a new level and mechanism of engagement for organizations and agencies to get involved in wildlife transportation accommodation projects. In developing the project program, the partnership is committing to a process to solicit, review, and provide feedback on proposals, and potentially help with preliminary design for those that are selected to move forward. As you'll hear this afternoon from our presenters, there will be a lot of detail about what needs to go into a proposal. It will be on the proposer, those of you submitting proposals, to make sure you address those details as required in the application in order to have a complete proposal application that can move forward. You can't just say there should be an overpass here and expect to get any traction. There's a lot of detail in these proposals, but they are necessary in order to make sure we are able to do the best projects. The partnership has also developed a planning tool that we talked about on Monday that interested entities can use to help understand where higher priority areas might be, as well as to assemble and justify proposals. There's a link on the website that you saw at the beginning here, and you'll see throughout the effort that you can find that planning tool, as well as in a week or two, the recording from that webinar will be available as well. The planning tool was developed by our data and information work group. It's a great resource. It involves data sources that have been compiled, weighted, and ranked that represent key criteria for identifying areas of need across the state. So this afternoon's webinar is going to be focused on the project program, and will include presentations on the program, what it is, and how to engage in the process. Speakers include members of the Partnership Steering Committee that have been involved in development of this program. And they include Stephanie Adams, who's with the National Parks Conservation Association and Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage, Dwayne Kiley, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Montana Department of Transportation, and Deb O'Neill, who's with the Special Projects Manager at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Director's Office. Each of these people will speak and walk you through different parts of the project. If you have questions, again, there's that Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen where you can enter a question. And then we'll have staff from our technical group that will moderate and provide those questions to the presenters. Those staff include Deb Wambach, who's from Montana Department of Transportation, Brooke Schifrin, who's with the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, and Justin Goody, who's with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And again, they'll be reviewing the questions as you guys type them in, and then we'll have them ready to ask the presenters. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Adams to begin talking about the project.
Thank you, Ken. And just let me know if you can't hear me at all.
Oh, we can hear you.
Sounds good. So once again, my name is Stephanie Adams. I'm with the National Parks Conservation Association here on behalf of Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage. As Ken noted, this is a new program that will enable state agencies to partner with tribal nations, local government, organizations, and community members to leverage each other's resources, expertise, capacity, and funding to advance projects that are specifically designed to reduce wildlife collisions and support habitat connectivity. In order to evaluate the feasibility and expected benefits of a project, the project application requires comprehensive information on numerous aspects of the project. We certainly acknowledge that this application can seem a bit daunting, but encourage you to complete these questions to the best of your ability, and also consider using this as an opportunity to engage with partners, including MDT and FWP. Applicants can propose projects that are at various scales and stages of development. This ranges from projects that are at the concept level to ones that are further along. A project is more likely to advance if it's collaborative, well-designed, and supported by the community. As well, it's also helpful if it's substantiated by compelling data and has potential funding sources identified or secured. Applications will only be accepted if they're complete, but especially those in more of a concept phase. This is a space to acknowledge where more evaluation might be needed, or better yet, a chance to connect with MDT and FWP to design a project together. So the project application outline that we're walking through today is available on the website as Appendix A. But in order to submit, you'll need to complete an online fillable form of the application that will be available at the start of each application cycle. The first cycle will run from May 1st to May 31st. The next is expected to open on November 1st and run through the end of the month. And then we anticipate 1 to 2 cycles per year after that. Just a note, in the online form, the text boxes are limited to 4,000 characters. This is intended to ensure you have enough space to provide clear and descriptive narratives while still being concise enough so that we can move through the application review in a timely process. You can also include a lot of information as attachments. As you're preparing an application, take some time to look at Appendix C, which outlines these attachments, as well as Appendix B, which provides an example of a project budget. Dwayne is going to go into more detail on what a project budget could look like, but this gives you a high-level idea. As you're starting to look through the application, we also encourage you to read through the resources that are on the website. This includes the detailed project application guidance, which provides direction on the type of information that should be considered and included for each application, as well as resources for where some of this information can be obtained. You should also take a look at the steering committee project selection criteria. Later on, Deb will cover how projects will be evaluated, but this is the tool that the partnership steering committee will use to evaluate each application. It provides further guidance on the type of information and project that will not only have a better chance of advancing through the selection process, but will also have the components needed to address public safety and support wildlife. Let's now spend just a bit of time walking through ways to successfully approach the different sections of the application. As a reminder, as we go along, please enter your questions in the Q&A box. We'll stop for questions midway through and at the end. So in addition to contact details of the applicant and a designated contact person if that's different, it's important to include the names and contact information of immediately adjacent or directly impacted landowners. This could be included as an attachment. This baseline information can be found through sources such as the Montana Cadastral. This will be helpful if a project moves forward, as discussions or agreements might be required before any project advancement. There's also a chance here to include whether or not you've discussed the project with these landowners. While it's not a requirement, and it might not be necessary based on the type of project, the success of this program depends on the continued support of the community. And so we encourage engaging landowners and the broader community as often as possible. You'll then move into the portion about providing a reference for your project and helping us understand the location. This is kind of just a short descriptive title that makes it easy to get an initial sense of your idea. It could be something like Happy Valley Overpass or Underpass on Highway 123 west of Happyville. As for location, try to be as specific as possible. If you're proposing spot improvements such as a structure or a jump out, include the discrete mile marker locations. For longer stretches of treatment, such as fencing or an animal detection system, include the mile marker ranges. Mile markers can be identified using the planning tool. As part of the application process, please include a map or multiple maps that show the site of the project, indicate if it's adjacent to public land, private land, as well as show other details. Appendix C outlines the items that should be included in map form. When you've identified a collision hotspot that you believe could be mitigated, ideally you've looked at the topography, the land use, the land ownership, and other information to make a really well-informed proposal as to where the project should be situated. However, if a project is based on compelling data and looks like it could reduce collisions, but there's a better spot nearby, we welcome the chance to work together to advance that. The goal of the project is to build partnerships and projects and pathways to get good projects on the ground. After you've provided some of the initial data, you'll now provide a high-level and concise overview of your project. You'll dig deeper in all these sections in the coming parts of the application, but this is the chance to really highlight the core premise of your proposal. It should include the following. First, you should identify the challenge you're trying to address. This could be something like a busy highway divides two portions of an elk herd's winter range, which is impacting the health of the herd, causing threats to drivers, and causing elk mortality. Next, you'll want to clearly identify your proposed solution. This should be a specific treatment. It could be something like installing 2 miles of fencing to divert elk toward an existing highway underpass, or constructing a wildlife-specific underpass and associated fencing. It should also include what you believe will be the expected benefit. This could be something like the health of the elk herd will improve due to increased access to their winter range. Other species such as bear, moose, or small mammals will also use the underpass, which will reduce mortality from collisions, and it will respond to concerns from the local community who worry about the threat of injury and cost of hitting an elk along this stretch of highway. Think of this section really as your elevator pitch. What would you say if you had 2 minutes with leadership at MDT or FWP? What do you want to tell them that's going to make them want to take a deeper look together? You'll now move into the portions of the application that are scored. Once again, we encourage you to take some time and review Appendix D. This outlines the criteria that the steering committee will use to evaluate each of the following sections. This section is really the chance to build the case for why we should invest resources in this project, recognizing that there are numerous transportation infrastructure needs across the state. You'll want to begin by building out the challenge, proposed solution, and expected benefits that you just briefly outlined. This is the chance to expand these 3 components, as well as incorporate some of the research and data that backs up your premise. You'll dive deeper into the data, specifics of the proposed project, and the expected benefits in the next 3 sections. This section should really summarize those pieces and tell the primary story of your project's purpose. You'll now start to move into providing the support as to why you believe this project will address the challenge you've raised. You'll need to provide detailed summaries of the data that support your project's purpose and need. This section should really be a summary of that data. What story does the data tell? You should attach original data summaries, analysis as attachments, but you'll want to identify the sources you're referencing in this section. Please include both broad scale data as well as localized data. Broad scale data is really the information that informs why you're proposing a project in this general landscape. This could include research that models specific species movement and shows the importance of the general area, modeling of areas of connectivity, just to name a few. We also encourage you to take a look at the research and data that forms the foundation of the planning tool. The planning tool has utility beyond providing an overall heat map. You can dive deeper into the specific criteria that went into developing the planning tool, such as barrier effect or wildlife movement for the different highway segments. We'd encourage you to look at the planning tool help guide or take a look at the webinar that was recorded earlier this week that shows how to use the planning tool. In addition to data that supports why this general landscape is important for your project, you'll want to include finer scale assessments that show specifically why this spot is in need of a project. These could be based on professional consultation, GPS collar data, really boots on the ground observational data, camera trap data, crash and carcass collection data, or citizen science such as the Roads app. You should also include the average score the segment has from the planning tool. You'll want to identify the overall footprint of your project. So for example, it wouldn't just be where the overpass is, but also if there's associated fencing, that broader footprint. And then use the planning tool assessment score for each of those segments to develop an average score for the project. You'll now move into really outlining specifically what your treatment is. This is where you'll want to precisely lay out the specific features and strategies of your project. Make sure you include all features and strategies, show how they relate back to the purpose and need. You'll want to include dimensions, locations, length, etc. for each strategy. And you'll want to identify if this is new infrastructure or a retrofit of existing infrastructure. So one example might be if we were building an underpass for deer in an area of elevated deer vehicle collisions, you could propose a reinforced concrete box culvert, noting that it would be 14 feet wide, 9 feet tall, and 145 feet long. It would include a half-mile of wildlife exclusionary fencing with a fourth of a mile stretch on each side along the right-of-way. You could note that it would have 4 wildlife jump outs to allow animals that are within the highway side of the fence section to escape to the outside of the fencing. And you might also include landscape features within the underpass for small mammal habitat, as well as some cover planting to guide animals to the opening. This is another space where if you've really made a solid case for the purpose and need, but some adjustments are needed in terms of the exact feature design from the perspective of the agencies, a project could still move forward, especially if it's seeking feasibility funding. This is another area where you should take a look at the attachment guide. And if possible, we are hoping that you'll be able to provide aerial photos of the project site, potentially with general sketches of what the project could look like, as well as other details if they're available. In this portion, you'll have the opportunity to outline why your proposed solution will address the purpose and need that you outline. You've laid out the problem, you've proposed a solution. Now you need to show us why your solution will work. What will change on the ground, and how do you know that your project will lead to this change? Really, can you clearly articulate and back up the benefits regarding safety and wildlife connectivity? This could include examples such as literature of how certain infrastructure helps species, or studies of how different species use crossings. It could include expert opinion that shows that this particular design resolved the identified problem in similar areas. And you can also look to data from similar situations or expert opinion based on their experience in working on securing infrastructure to support wildlife crossings. Again, please include relevant sources. It's really important to note, as Ken identified, this program is built on the premise that projects will be successful if they're driven by the community and really evolve from the ground up. With that in mind, we strongly encourage engaging the community as part of the project planning process. The practical reality is that if a project is adjacent to private land, it won't be successful unless the impacted landowners are on board. There's also a need to engage the broader community to not only build support and investment in the project, but also to increase the success of the project by being able to incorporate community knowledge and partnership. Some examples of community engagement could be individual meetings with landowners or stakeholders, citizen science or mapping exercises, or events. Really, the scope of a project can help determine the type and amount of community engagement that is needed. There are numerous ways that you can show this engagement in your application. This could include attaching letters of support or formal endorsements, documenting outreach and community engagement, and demonstrating communication with adjacent or directly affected landowners. In addition to engaging the community, it's also really important to look at how the project fits on the broader landscape. We can't simply look at the stretch of road and the small swath of land on either side. There needs to be a broader evaluation as to whether this project fits within the landscape. It would not be the best use of limited resources or support wildlife in the long run to invest in crossing infrastructure that, for example, funnels wildlife into an area that could be subdivided in the future or has other uses that are not compatible. You need to consider the surrounding landscape and land use to determine if this is an appropriate place for an investment. What is really the broader community or management vision for this landscape? This could include things such as land protections, whether it's conservation easements or public land. What does the zoning and covenants look like in the area? Are there management plans or guidance from nearby land management agencies or local governments? You could identify whether or not it's in the state wildlife action plan focal areas or other directions for wildlife management agencies. Really just looking for protections, plans, policies, management direction or vision that supports that this area's management is in alignment with an investment to address wildlife vehicle collisions. In addition to looking at what the land use and land protection is in the area, it's also helpful to understand how complementary projects or conservation efforts in the proposed area could create conditions that will make an accommodation particularly successful. Once again, think about projects that are directly adjacent to the site, as well as efforts on the broader landscape. This could include efforts such as habitat restoration or wildlife-friendly fencing projects. It could also be things such as efforts to reduce human-wildlife conflict, such as range riders or carcass pickup or securing attractants. These are really just a few examples. For each of these, please include the status of the effort, who's implementing it, and how you believe the effort will benefit the success of the overall project. This is another nod to the importance of engaging the community to learn about what is going on the broader landscape and how these efforts can be complementary. And finally, the project is really built on the premise that there's a need to establish public-private partnerships to develop, propose, and apply for wildlife accommodation projects. In this section, we're asking you to outline the project partners and identify the role that each partner is playing in either developing, implementing, or funding the project. You'll want to identify who are the partners and what are they contributing from funding, capacity, expertise, community engagement, data collection. These are the types of pieces you'll want to identify. The more complex the project, the more important it is that MDT and FWP have been actively involved in developing the project concept. Ideally, you've engaged with them ahead of time to determine which elements of the proposal are needed and whether it makes sense for the agency to be the lead on certain parts. If that's the case, you'll want to make sure, with their permission, you've included them as part of the partnership. It really comes down to the fact that we can't address wildlife safety accommodations alone. Together, we can identify projects to best leverage investments in the safety of all Montanans and the connectivity of our diverse landscapes for wildlife movement. With that, I'll turn it over to Dwayne to talk about the next part.
Thanks, Stephanie, and great job, by the way. Bear with me 1 second. Hopefully you're seeing my presentation.
Dwayne, oh, there you go. Yep.
Okay. All righty. Thanks, everybody. And let me kick it off with a real quick joke. Do you know why they don't gamble in Africa? There's too many cheetahs. So with that bad dad joke, let me jump right in. I'm here to talk about the cost estimate and revenue worksheet, as well as the feasibility section of the application. But one thing I want to really reiterate before we move too far is something Ken and Stephanie have mentioned is, please take a few moments, go review the selection criteria and the guidance documents, not only prior to filling out your application, but during and afterwards, to make sure that you do the best at completing the application and meeting all the requirements that we're looking for. With that, jumping in, the biggest point, or a few points I've got on this slide, is number one, first off, be prepared. Road construction can be expensive, and we truly mean that. Next, please work with MDT staff, FWP, or consultants on your cost estimate. We very much would like to help you on this process in this worksheet. We are experts in this area, and we have experience that we can share with you. If you choose to be that do-it-yourselfer like I tend to be, there is a hyperlink to take you to the average bid prices within MDT's website. Furthermore, please be prepared and aware that an incomplete cost estimate or revenue could be cause for rejection of an application. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. Next off, as you go through the funding, we'll talk about other options for funding revenues, such as philanthropic donations, private grants, private funds, local governments, or even other grants, federal grants that are out there and available to you. Please be advised that MDT is ponying up or offering up about $500,000 per year for feasibility studies on those more complex projects. MDT may provide some funding for design and construction, but again, it's going to be capped at that $500,000 per year total. Furthermore, there are going to be requirements for maintenance and operations of the projects. We may be asking that the the applicant provide an agency sponsor for certain maintenance or operation activities. With that, diving into the cost estimate sheet, I've given you kind of an example here. The main point I want on this section is a couple of things. One is this section of the cost estimate is predominantly autofill. It's filled by values from down below. However, there is some things you need to fill in, such as the applicant, the contact name, project name. Furthermore, you need to fill in the right-of-way if right-of-way is going to be required. Your application should describe whether or not right-of-way is required or not, and then give us an estimate of how many acres, and then your best estimate at the value of that. Also, you can use this section in here to guide you on adding additional rows if you have additional items to fill in here. In the next section of the cost estimate, this is the main portion where you would fill in any major items that you're proposing to build. As Stephanie mentioned earlier, if you're proposing a box culvert, please use our bid prices to get a consistent item in here, and then use our bid prices for the units that are going to be measured, the length, and then our bid prices for the value in here. When I mentioned earlier that an incomplete worksheet could be cause for rejection of the application, we're looking for the major items. So if you miss some minor things, that's not going to be item for rejection. But if you are proposing an undercrossing or an overcrossing and you don't include that value in here, that could be cause for rejection of the application. These items down here are what we call autofill fields. You've got a couple of selections in each area. In particular, traffic control is 2. It's either on-road or off-road. Then you've got contingency, and there's 3 levels here. Is there no design done, minimal design done, or is the design complete? Based on your selection, it'll autofill a percentage that will generate this estimate. And then last but not least is the years to construction. What we would offer up is, please understand that a feasibility study is going to take about a year and then about another 3 years for design. Now, our intent is to move that way faster than that, but please use those values for your initial estimate. Going on next, we've included this with the cost estimate as well. And most importantly, here's that hyperlink that I mentioned that will take you to our award sheet archives, and most importantly, our average bid prices. There is also additional explanation in here for many of the rows contained within the cost estimate. Next, we jump into the revenue or funding sheet. The biggest points in here are we have 3 types of funding that you will have to select in here. The first one being secured. Secured by our definition is essentially any money that is in hand or by agreement already garnered. Pending is any funding that has been applied for or is in agreement with a reliable source, such as an adjacent landowner or a philanthropist. All other funding would be classified as possible. The other main point I want to make here is that please do not rely on MDT funding the entirety of the project. The whole intent of this program is for it to be a public-private partnership. Moving to the next slide, we're going to start diving into the feasibility. Before we talk too much about feasibility, we need to identify there's 2 levels of projects that we've identified within the program. First off, there's those less complex projects. Less complex projects are predominantly minor fencing along the right-of-way or outside of the right-of-way, vegetative management, signing, or other projects where there's no major equipment and most of the disturbance or activity is either on the edge or outside of the right-of-way. The next level of project is a more complex project. Those projects are going to be longer stretches of wildlife fencing along the right-of-way or in the interstate right-of-way or other modifications or new existing infrastructure. As we dive into the feasibility section of the application, certain criteria will be applied to less complex and certain criteria will be applied to more complex. In some segments, they will be both projects included. So first off, talking about engineering or technical experts. For less complex projects, we'd like you to identify what kind of utilities are in the area, what kind of right-of-way impacts could be, what kind of structural conflicts are in the area. When it comes to utilities, the best guidance I've got for you is on all of our roadways outside of the interstate, assume utilities are present. On more complex projects, we'd like you to identify the items above, as well as any kind of consultants or MDT staff that you've consulted with. And we do highly recommend that you do work either with us or other consultants, private consultants out there. Also identify potential impacts to the traveling public. Are you going to be working adjacent to the roadway? Are you going to be installing things on or underneath the roadway? Then lastly, what kind of right-of-way considerations are there? Are we going to have to acquire right-of-way for this project? And is there an adjacent or willing landowner willing to sell that right-of-way to it? And before I forget, one other item is the anticipated project schedule and duration. What time frame do you think this is going to take? The next section is the biological or ecological feasibility. Here we would like you to describe, irrespective of the level of project, more complex or less complex, we would like you to describe the consultants, either MDT, FWP, or tribal experts you've consulted with. Furthermore, who are the road ecologists you've worked with? And what are those discussions? What are those explanations? What supporting documentation have they provided for you? Furthermore, what endorsements or potential concerns have they raised? Clearly explain these or provide explanations of those interactions. Next, we're going to move into construction proposal. In this area, what we're looking for is on less complex projects, what is your plan for the project features, work activities, equipment? What is your work plan? What kind of equipment are you going to use? Are you going to be working with MDT right away, or are you going to be working from the adjacent landowner's land? If you're within the right of way, we would recommend that you look into what kind of traffic control plan is going to be required. Even though you're off the roadway, it still may require traffic control, as too many drivers want to be onlookers and could get distracted and veer from the roadway. So we want you and them to be protected. On more complex projects, again, we want the above to be addressed, as well as what is your contracting plan? Are you going to go hire a contractor? Are you expecting MDT to hire a contractor? Is your contractor going to be licensed or insured, bonded? Are you planning on securing an encroachment permit? Is the contractor going to secure the traffic control plan? How are all those items going to be addressed? In the next slide, we're going to address post-construction ability monitoring. And the one thing I really want to stress here is that for all projects, this is scalable. We are not asking for the moon. We're just simply asking for what is your post-monitoring proposal relative to the size of your project. For example, are you going to be providing tracking beds or cameras? As you see in some of the pictures, many of our undercrossings, we put in cameras. There's in-depth research, or you could simply be looking at the wildlife vehicle collision data and looking for a reduction in animal vehicle collisions. We want to know what your plan is, what the benefits are, and how you're going to measure that. Ultimately, we want to see success from these projects, and we want to be able to measure that. Last but not least is maintenance and operational proposals. One of the things, anytime we put in infrastructure in the right of way, that has to be maintained. We would like the proposer to be responsible for that day-to-day maintenance. How is that going to be accomplished? And by day-to-day, we're referring to, say, fence repair, vegetative management, all those kind of things. Also be aware that we may require an agency sponsor to do that, as some entities may not be secured for the future. We would like an entity that we know will be in place well into the future. We also could be willing to look at bonding for that maintenance responsibility. One thing of note is any kind of major structures that are placed in the right of way, MDT will take responsibility. We have to, because we have to protect the traveling public. So we will take responsibility for the repair, inspection, and replacement of any major structures. Other items could be operational items such as power, solar, cellular, or VMS type signs. Be aware we may require you to provide that operational responsibility. And again, please be aware that agreements may be required and we will be looking for an agency sponsor. So work with your local government, either the county or a tribal government. Please try to secure those agreements. With that, we'd like to move into our first Q&A section and take questions and answer as best we can.
Thanks, Dwayne. Our first question is for you, Dwayne. The question is, it seems like some of those specifics that deal with the features and strategies of a project are the role of MDT, since they would be the ones doing the engineering, would they not? And so maybe, Dwayne, if you could just speak a bit to the potential roles of MDT in working with applicants on actually designing a project.
That's a great question, and thanks, Brooke. The role that we would like to take is a facilitator role. As mentioned earlier, we've got a contact list on our website. Please click on that, submit your question where you're at. We will put you in touch with the most appropriate MDT staff to help guide you on those options. Again, this program is set up to be a public-private partnership. So we don't want MDT coming in and doing all the engineering and design and telling the public where all these things should go. We want the public to coordinate in partnership with us and FWP and MSWP for these projects. But again, we are more than happy to help you and assist you with those. And we'll actually talk in more detail as we move into feasibility later on in the presentation.
Okay, Dwayne, here is another question for you. Can these projects forwarded through the program be matched with the FHWA current grants available to help fully fund a project, recognizing that many of the current grants have similar goals as our program and that at least 20% match is required?
Great question, and thank you. Yes, and I will cover that a little bit more detail later on in the presentation during implementation. Yes, that is one option. My guidance to people is please do not do not rely solely on a grant in the future, as that part of the application will not be scored overly well. We're looking for a P3 type process, public-private partnership, where funding comes from a multitude of sources. Having dealt with federal aid grants, they are anything but guaranteed. So the more that we can bring in multiple funding sources, the more a project is going to score, or better a project's going to score.
Thanks, Dwayne. And one more here for you while you're at it. Many government grants require the state DOT to provide a letter of support or be a co-applicant for work that will be done on their roads. Some grants may not be available every year. So the question here is, at what point in this project development process would MDT decide whether they would provide support for such grant applications? And how should this be handled in the funding portion of the project application?
Another great question. And again, we'll cover a little bit of that when we move into the implementation side. But most of the projects that are going to look for a grant are most likely going to be those more complex projects. And as we'll discuss in the implementation section, those projects will, if they're going to look for using MDT or federal aid highway funding, then they will need to go through a feasibility study. Once we are done with that feasibility study, that would be the time frame in which case MDT would be willing to make the decision if we support a grant application for that project or not. The one thing I would add is that what we are seeing nationwide is that state DOTs are not the most successful in the grants. It's typically local governments that are more successful. So I do think it's best if we can find a local government to submit the grant, and we would be the supporter of that grant rather than being the submitter of that grant.
Okay, thanks, Dwayne. Stephanie, we have a few questions for you, I think. First question is, can nonprofits work as an agency sponsor?
So I think the really great part about this particular project is that anyone can put forth a proposal. So it could be a nonprofit organization, it could be an individual citizen, it could be a member of MDT or FWP staff. But ideally, what we'd like to see is people coming together and putting in projects collectively. And so, you know, ideally you'd have a project that's put forth by potentially a nonprofit with maybe a local government and a tribal nation and has an MDT staffer that's willing to engage as well. So anybody can apply for this project. I think that answers the question.
Well, I'm curious, Dwayne, if you have anything to answer, because you did mention agency sponsor in a few sections of your portion of the application. Do you want to help explain specifically what an agency sponsor means to you with regard to agreements as well? And thanks for that answer, Stephanie. That was good.
Yes, and Stephanie is right on. We want this program to be more of a partnership with multiple entities. When it comes to the agreement, though, we're going to look for an entity that is either in statute or somehow or another for sure going to be there in 3, 5, 10 years when that maintenance is required. Typically, we look to a local government or a tribal government of some sort. The way that we could work around that would be if there was some sort of a bond set up to assure the department that that maintenance is going to take place well into the future. The other thing I want to add is a clarification. MDT staff are more than welcome to work with NGOs, any other entity on submitting an application. But to be clear, MDT itself cannot submit an application. We wanted to make sure that it did not appear that MDT was submitting applications and a potential for impropriety. So we are the only entity that is not allowed to submit an application on our behalf. Our staff can work on them, but we as an entity will not submit them.
Thanks, Dwayne.
All right, Dwayne, I'm going to direct this next question to you. For a simple sign project, for example, something like sheep crossing here, is there any estimate of how much time the application process and approval would take?
So the application process, what we're estimating right now is anywhere from 2 to 4 months to make it through or 2 to 3 months, sorry, to make it through the application scoring, and then go, no, and then further into the final scoring of the application. After that, if that project is scored and selected to move forward, I think that is one of them that I'll cover in the implementation. That would be a fairly quick, fairly fast project to deliver.
Okay, and we have one more, and Dwayne, again, you might be the most appropriate. Are maintenance and operation agreements durations expected to be for the design life, for example, 50 to 75 years of a structure, if an underpass or an overpass were proposed?
So the agreement would be, in the maintenance and operations, the maintenance would be for the reasonable maintenance and operation activities. Again, though, if we're going to talk about something like the design life of an undercrossing or overcrossing, MDT is taking on that responsibility. We're going to assume that role. We don't want the risk of somebody disappearing, not having the funds, whatever, we want to make sure that we're protecting the traveling public. So those major structures, MDT will take that on. What we're looking for is those more day-to-day type items, such as maybe power or, you know, cellular VMS signs, vegetation, fencing, those kind of things that we don't normally take on that maintenance operations.
And so just to follow up to that, then would those agreements with the, I mean, including the day-to-day maintenance and operation of, say, the fencing or cell tower connection, whatever it may be, is that expected for the lifespan of the implementation as well? I mean, so for 25 to 50 to 75 years, whatever it might be.
It would be on a case-by-case basis, but yes, my take on it would be yes, it would be for the lifespan of that that device, knowing that some devices such as a cell tower, you know, they have a short lifespan, unlike an over or under crossing. It all depends on what function it's providing. But yes, the intent would be that they would operate it and maintain it for the lifespan of that device.
Okay, thank you.
And this is a question directed at MDT. And so Dwayne, go ahead. But Stephanie, you might offer some great perspective here too. MDT periodically has projects that they cannot fully fund, wildlife accommodations. Does this process allow for MDT to engage NGOs and others to help fund accommodations?
The really short answer to that, the really easy answer to that is yes. To explain that a little bit, the longer is yes, we're always looking for third-party contributions. If somebody wants to come in and participate on one of our projects and fund an additional infrastructure or additional items, we're more than happy to work with them and make that happen.
And I would also add, I've really been looking at this process and this development of this project as a way to really open up and expand conversations across the state about ways that not only can we advance these standalone wildlife accommodation projects, but also a way to continue to build relationships. And so if there was a project that MDT were advancing on its own and there were opportunities for components for wildlife mitigation, you know, maybe there are relationships built where a nonprofit or a foundation come in and support that outside of this application process. And so have really appreciated the conversation that this opened up, and hope that applicants really feel that this is an opportunity for them to engage in broader conversations with MDT and FWP.
So thanks, Stephanie. I think that was a great answer as well. An item of clarification on that then, Dwayne, based on your answer of yes, and based on Stephanie's added information, would that solicitation of third-party contributions for wildlife accommodations being proposed through MDT highway projects, our internal wildlife accommodation process, would that go through this project program, or would that be, as Stephanie described, outside of this program and through our relationships through our wildlife accommodation process?
Great question, Deb. I think I'm tracking with you. Let me see if I can answer it. So to be clear, MDT does have a wildlife accommodations process that we go through for all of our major reconstruct type projects. And if that identifies a wildlife accommodation being required or mitigation being required within the project, we make that part of the project. Now, we'd love people to come in and offer up money and help pay for that, but it's not a requirement. It is our commitment to the public, to our partners out there, that we will fund that portion of the project. If we do not identify a wildlife accommodation mitigation being required within a project, and somebody would like to come in and offer to expand our project scope for something that we're not feeling is necessarily warranted to be funded by federal aid or taxpayer dollars, we'd be more than happy to include that. But again, they would have to then fund that project or that portion of the project. Did I answer that?
Yes, thank you. I think that was a very important distinction. Thank you.
All right, this is a question for both of you, Dwayne and Stephanie, and maybe Stephanie, you can kick us off. One potential concern is that because projects are expensive, it's possible we'll see more small scale projects submitted through this process. For example, fencing. A proliferation of fencing could reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, but have limited benefits to wildlife connectivity. And so the question is there some sort of requirement, as there is in the Wildlife Crossings pilot program, that projects must consider and address both human safety and wildlife movement improvements?
That's a great question. And it's been really exciting to see with the new federal pilot program that they are really looking at both of those aspects, and in some ways pretty equally. What's really nice about this program is the way the application is set up and the way the scoring is set up. Projects that are supporting connectivity for wildlife, having benefits for species that maybe are threatened and endangered, and improve public safety and reduce costs to public will actually have a better chance of moving through this process. And so while it is likely we'll potentially see some smaller scale projects, I think our hope is really to say, what are some projects that we can get out on the ground that will have a big impact and that will really resonate with this idea that we can not only protect drivers, but can also support the valued wildlife of Montana.
The addition I'd have to what Stephanie said, and what she said is great, right on par. And Deb O'Neill's going to cover a little bit in her section, but as we go through the scoring process, MDT and FWP and MSWP, we're going to have our staff look at the application processes. And I'll freely admit, I'm an engineer, I'm not a biologist. I can tell you what provides good safety for the traveling public, but I cannot tell you what is good connectivity for wildlife. I'm going to work, well, meaning I and Tom Martin, the two steering committee members for MDT, we're going to work with our biologists and we're going to have those discussions. We are very concerned that if we're going to put up something that fragments connectivity and does not provide a significant benefit to the traveling public and safety, that's probably not going to score real well on our side. So that is something we are definitely going to consider as we go through the application process, and most importantly, the scoring process.
Super, thanks. I think we just have time for a couple more at this juncture, and then we'll have another Q&A at the end of the talk today. So a question perhaps for you, Dwayne, and it should be a simple one, hopefully. If a sign or a fence or other simple structure is damaged by traffic, for example, who's responsible for fixing that? And that is probably answered in the maintenance agreement, but if you could provide any clarification now, that'd be appreciated.
So typically what happens in highway crashes is actually the insurance company of the driver will actually cover the costs of replacing those. Our maintenance staff will go out, replace the sign, replace the fence, and then we will bill the insurance company. If there's a maintenance agreement in place, which hopefully there is, with the maintenance agreement, if for some reason we aren't able to track down the insurance company, we will work with the project sponsor or the agency sponsor to either have them replace the fencing sign, or we will replace it and bill them if need be.
Thanks, Dwayne. I think this is another just clarification question around the role of federal funding in these types of projects. And so just given the uncertainty around the length of the application process and approval process, just how would one go about incorporating federal funding into a project proposed through this process? Can you provide, Dwayne, any clarification there?
So let me start off with an assumption. When they say federal funding, I'm assuming they're talking about some sort of grant funding. And with that, the way it would be accommodated is once we go through the selection process, We will then move into the feasibility analysis. Once we complete the feasibility analysis, that would be the time for either the sponsor agency or MDT or whomever to go ahead and submit an application for a grant. We most likely well, let me be crystal clear, sorry. We're not going to move into design until all the funding is secured. So we would wait to proceed into design on that project until such time as that grant is awarded.
Thanks for that, Dwayne. That's helpful.
Okay, thanks. I think that wraps our Q&A for the first session, and we will turn it over to Deb to talk about project evaluation and selection. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, there we go. I couldn't unmute for some reason. All right, let me turn on my camera. There we go. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about what kind of happens behind the scenes. Can everybody see my screen okay? Can anybody hear me?
Looks good, Deb.
Okay. Okay, thanks. My name is Deb O'Neill. I work for Fish Wildlife Parks here in Helena, and I'm the Special Projects Manager. I'm also on the steering committee along with Ken McDonald for FWP. So like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about what happens after the application is submitted. Stephanie went over the criteria that we're going to assess the applications on. So when I mentioned criteria, that's what I'm talking about, what Stephanie was talking about. So I don't think this should take too long. After we get the submissions, the steering committee, all 6 members of the steering committee, will review the submitted project applications through a standardized process using that criteria that Stephanie talked about to determine whether the project will advance to the next step. Now, there's not a set number of projects that might be selected in any application cycle, and the application cycle in this first one is May 1 to May 31. But the number and types and scale and scope and locations of the projects previously accepted into the program, agency capacity and available resources will play a role in determining what projects are selected or how many projects are selected each cycle. Like I said, the steering committee will use those application responses to score each criterion through on our own and through discussion with each other and through consensus. And we're going to be using a 5-step process to do that. Let me see if I can make my slideshow move now. There we go. So we're going to all 6 of us are separately going to review the each application as they come in, depending on how we get them or how many we get, or in one big batch. I know a lot of people like doing it differently. So some of us will be reviewing as they come in and others will be reviewing it in a batch. After that, we're going to get together, all 6 members are going to get together, and through consensus, we're going to decide whether a project application will move to the next step. And this is a first very coarse cut, and really only major flaws are going to prevent the proposals from being advanced. And these are things like the purpose and need of the project is not clear. There's an incomplete cost estimate or budget worksheet, or just an overall incomplete application. So I want to stress here that the problem, the solution, and the benefits to this project must be very, very clear in a meaningful way. If it's not clear or other major flaws, they won't go forward. Now, the project contact will be notified regarding the steering committee's decision. And if a project is not advanced, we will give an explanation regarding our decision. We might provide guidance on how this declined project can be improved for a future application cycle. So not in the current one, but a future one down the road. Now, if the application is advanced, subject matter experts, and this is what Dwayne was touching on, Subject matter experts from MDT, FWP, and MSWP will further evaluate an application to provide input to their steering committee members. For instance, they might see red flags or major issues, or they could see real good enhancements, and they'll share that with their committee representatives. These subject matter experts could include engineers, biologists, and even, communication experts. They're going to be whomever we might need to best review these applications. The committee members will take the input and use it to help score the criteria in the applications. And each entity, MDT, FWP, and SWP, will bring a single score. So for instance, Ken and I will get together and come up with a single score for each application and bring it for discussion in the next step. So we will reconvene and discuss all the scored applications, and using a consensus-based decision-making approach. And that means we're going to debate, we'll explain the rationale behind our scores. Each application will receive one single score from the steering committee, and the steering committee will then determine what project proposals will advance to the next step. Again, the project contact will be notified regarding our decision, and if a project is not advanced, the project contact will receive an explanation from us regarding why it was scored the way it was and why it's not moving forward. The committee also might provide guidance on how a declined proposal can be improved for, again, a future application cycle. Applications that were not selected in the current application cycle will be eligible for resubmittal during a future application cycle upon any suggested changes made in an improved improved application. Now, projects that do move on, they might be approved for advancement, but there still might be some recommendations and minor modifications that might not necessitate resubmittal. Deb mentioned earlier on, perhaps there might be a better crossing in that same area for an accommodation, and it might not be at the exact spot that the proposal suggests, but we can work with the submitter and to move that project proposal. Excuse me. This will be determined by the committee on a per project basis. And the last step, projects selected by committee will advance to the next steps for analysis, design, and implementation. The duration and complexity of the process will depend on the scope and scale of the project. The steering committee will communicate the next steps for project development and implementation to the contact for the selected projects. Now, Dwayne touched on about how long this will take, and we're looking at about 3 to 4 months, we think, especially this first round. We don't, this is the first time we're doing this. We're not sure what to expect in terms of applications and complexity. So the application will close May 31st. The application cycle will close. We'll review applications May and June and make our first cut in June. We'll notify the applicants the beginning of July. And then our subject matter experts will start reviewing applications in July, and we're going to give them some time for that. And then in August, we'll meet to score and decide what projects advance. So probably for this first cycle, applications close May 31st, and probably in September, we'll notify applicants of their project advancement or not. And then, of course, we start all over November 1 this year. And that's all I got.
Excellent job. Thanks, Deb. You guys are making it tough to follow you.
I didn't have any pretty pictures, Dwayne, on mine.
All righty. Give me a shout out and let me, come on. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes, we are.
Awesome sauce. All righty. Great job, Deb, and thank you. Welcome back, everybody. It's me again. And the next section, we're going to discuss what does project implementation look like? And what I'm talking about is once a project is selected to move forward, what is the course of action that it's going to go through? Before we go into that, I'd like to make this an easier explanation. I'm going to break it up into two different parts. And we're going to talk first about the projects that have no MDT or FHWA funding. And that's wholly privately funded. So 0 MDT or FHWA funds. The other category is any projects that are proposing to have MDT or FHWA funding in them, even $1. And that's key. Even $1 is going to require a different course of action. Before we jump into it, I'm an engineer and I got to do this. Or no, wait a second. I picked this sign specifically because project development is a challenge. And this sign is very, very duplicative or explanatory about just how challenging that project development process can be. Plus, it's kind of funny. So anyways, next slide. As an engineer, I had to do this. I had to show you. For two reasons I wanted to show you. This is the flow chart that we built for project implementation. I'm not expecting you to understand this or read this. I just want you to understand two things. One is we do have a plan. And secondly, unfortunately, it is fairly complex because project development or implementation is a very challenging process. But again, most importantly, we have a plan. With that, let's start out with the non-MDT funded projects. And starting with less complex projects, again, those are the fencing, signing, revegetation type projects. These could be implemented very, very simply. And what I mean by that is it could be as simple as the project sponsor working with our district staff, and we'll put you in touch with those, as well as the MDT and FWP biologists. Then you would work to secure an encroachment permit through the district maintenance chief or the district office. And here's a link to that. Once you get the encroachment permit, you are authorized to go build your project. Again, fairly simple process. Shouldn't take more than a month or 2 or 3, depending on what your proposal is. The next process is, again, non-MDT funded, privately funded projects, but more complex. What we're going to ask you to do is go hire a licensed, registered consultant, registered licensed engineer within the state of Montana to help you design your project. We already have what is called systems impact analysis process. We deal with developers every year, all the time, that have proposals to build infrastructure within our system. We're going to ask you to work through that process, in which case we will engage our experts to review that design, coordinate with you, help you with that. And then at the end of the design, we're going to ask you to sign an agreement, most likely again with an agency sponsor. At the conclusion of design, then it will be up to you to secure a contractor to go build your project. Keep in mind that contractors, again, going to be required to secure an encroachment permit and most likely required to develop a traffic control plan. But again, it's all in your control. The only thing MDT is reviewing your design and looking at any kind of issues or design challenges that could be presented to us. Now we're going to dive into those projects that are MDT or FHWA funded. Again, starting with less complex, again, fencing, signing, vegetation type projects. We're going to ask you to complete an agreement with the sponsor agency or an agency sponsor. That agreement's going to be around funding, who's funding it, what level of funding is being provided. We're going to talk, the agreement's going to cover post-construction monitoring, who's doing that and for what, and then also what is the short and long-term maintenance responsibilities required by all parties. From there, MDT or a consultant will complete the appropriate level of design. The proposing entity, and I want to make this very clear, the proposing entity will be included throughout the process, as well as any other public communication that is required with that. Once we get done with that design, we may have to modify the agreement a little bit, but if not, we'll simply move into bidding out the work to a contractor, or if it's small enough, we may have our MDT forces go complete the work. For these smaller projects, I would anticipate a year, 2 years at the most likely more around that year to 18-month time frame. Moving into more complex and MDT funded projects. Again, these are longer fencing projects, modifying an existing structure or proposing in new structures. Again, we're going to want to complete an agreement with the proposing agency, proposing agency sponsor. Again, it's going to cover the funding, the post-construction monitoring, and short-term, long-term maintenance responsibilities. And then we're going to initiate and complete a feasibility study. If the project is determined to be feasible, we'll move it into the design phase as long as funding is secured. If it's not feasible, we're going to return it to the applicant with an explanation of why the project proposal was deemed to be infeasible. Also keep in mind, again, we're going to have the proposing entity involved in the feasibility study. We will not cut you out of it. You will be a participant in that process. What I'd like to do is jump into really quick and explain what does a feasibility study process look like. Again, a reminder, if it's a less complex project, no study is required. We're going to move towards construction. If it's more complex, here's why we want to do the study. First and foremost, the federal rules are if we move into design of a project and it's later determined to be infeasible, i.e. we can't move to construction, MDT is responsible for paying those federal funds back. If we do a feasibility study, we are not required to pay those monies back. Now, I know that might seem goofy, and if we had a day or two, I could explain it to you, but trust me, that's the way the federal funding works. Next, what is a feasibility study going to look at? We're going to take a mile-high view, and it's going to be scalable. What are the high risks within the project? We want to go root out those risks. Do we have geotechnical concerns? Are the soils conducive? Is the geography in the area conducive to the proposal? For example, putting in an overcrossing in a flat plain type area is fairly infeasible. You have to haul in literally millions of yards of dirt to build the hill to get open over our highway. Conversely, we wouldn't want to put in an undercrossing in a section that's cutting through a hillside. So those are the things we want to look at. We're also going to look at constructability, post-construction monitoring, and maintenance. Most feasibility studies take between 6 to 18 months. We've had some go longer than 18 months, but those are on very complex projects. The big thing to keep in mind is any survey data, any information that we garner out of the feasibility study will be carried into the design process. So all that information is not lost. It's just carried into the design phase, and it's still used and valuable information. After completion of the feasibility study and the project is deemed feasible, that's when we want to work with the project sponsor and secure the funding sources. We can't move into design without knowing where the money's coming from. That's why I'm calling this slide "Show Me the Money" slide. One of the things we've talked about, we'd like to work with the project sponsor on is if there's an intent to garner philanthropic funding, we would be more than happy through the feasibility study to build a prospectus so that the project sponsor could take that to potential donors. It's been already asked a couple of times, what other funding sources are out there? As mentioned earlier, MDT is contributing. We've dedicated $500,000 per year to these efforts. Predominantly, most of that money will go towards feasibility studies, or at least it's anticipated most of the money will go that direction. However, if there is money left over, there is potential that could be used for design and potentially construction. There's opportunities for NGOs to do fundraising or other agency contributions. Last but not least, as it's been asked already, yes, we are very aware that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or called IIJA, also nicknamed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill, does have at least one category of discretionary grants specifically dedicated to wildlife crossings. Furthermore, actually produced by the ARC Solution Guide, there are 17 other grant opportunities within IIJA. While they're not as specific as the Wildlife Crossing Safety Pilot Program, there are other opportunities within the bill that total nearly 162 billion. The caveat I've got for everybody is while these numbers look really big, 350 million or 162 billion, keep in mind that these grants are available to most municipalities, tribes, and states throughout the nation, and they are highly competitive. So please don't assume you're going to get one of these grants. MDT applies every year for different grants, and to date, we've only gotten, I think, 2 in the last 10 years. Further in the project implementation, after we complete the feasibility study, it's deemed feasible and funding has been secured, MDT and/or a consultant will be initiated to complete the project design. Again, the applicant will be involved in that process as well as other members of the public as appropriate. We will also need to secure right-of-way and move impacted utilities. Once all that's done, there's a few options we have to initiate contracting with contractors. Our standard process is design, bid, build. That's the DBB in here. 3 other processes that we just received legislative approval for, and we will actually be delving into very heavily for this because they do truncate the time and they are cheaper avenues for delivering these projects are design build. Design build at a very high level is we basically put a proposal out and a contractor and a consultant team together, they make a proposal and bid the project. Design build usually takes about 18 months to secure a contractor and a design firm, get the design to enough level to begin construction. The other opportunity we have is through CMGC or progressive design build. I don't want to go into too much detail, but again, there are alternative contracting processes that do truncate the time to get to construction, as well as they are cost effective and cheaper than our traditional design bid build. From there, we do the favorite thing I love to do is build the project, begin and then go into post-construction monitoring. And then most importantly, after that, we're going to celebrate success. This program is hopefully will be hugely successful, and we want to celebrate our successes as we move forward. Few last minute slides. Together we can do great things. I think this slide says it all. There is new hope within this process and this program. Working together just like this young cow moose or calf moose in here, I think there's opportunities for us to have hope for new opportunities within Montana. In closing, before I turn it back to Ken or Deb, one thing I want to say is there have been a lot of people that have worked on this process over the years since 2018. And I'd really like to thank and recognize the members of the current and post steering committee, starting with Stephanie Adams, Tom Martin, Ken McDonald, Deb O'Neill, Kylie Paul, post members Paul Sealer, Charlie Sperry, Mike Tooley, and Lynn Zanto. Members of the Data Information Group, Brian Anderson, Liz Fairbank, Justin Goody, Andrew Jakes, Adam Messer, Gabe Prieb, and Paul Sturm. And last and by no means least, the pit crew. Brooke Schifrin, Justin Goody, former members, Barb Beck, Nick Clark, Hannah Jakes, Renee Lemon, Laramie Maxwell, Lori Hanaska Brown, and Lene Schroyer. If you've been paying attention, you probably noticed that I skipped one name in there, and I will not skip that name because probably the most important person in this entire process who has dedicated many, many hours keeping the steering committee and the pit crew and all of us in order and keeping this process moving forward has been none other than our Deb Wambach. She has done a tremendous job, and I cannot say enough about how grateful we are for her efforts on this process. With that, I will turn it to the question and answer session and back to Ken or Deb.
Well, thanks very much, Dwayne. I'm a little verklempt now, so I'm gonna just try and make it through Q&A. We couldn't have done it without the entire team. It's been a monumental effort to go from planning the summit to arriving at where we are today with the launch of our project program. So congratulations to everybody, and we look forward for sure to working with all of you and all of these new formed partnerships and collaborations to implement standalone wildlife accommodation projects in Montana. So thank you. And there are some questions coming in. So Brooke, I'll let you start us off. Thank you.
Sure. I'm going to direct this first question to you, Deb O'Neill. The question is, will there be an opportunity during the consensus decision-making process for some question and answer with those who have submitted an application if the steering committee has clarifying questions?
Sure. Thanks for that question. I guess I'm going to start by saying, hopefully, when you're filling out this application, you're working to make it as clear and concise as possible. So you're working with MDT, and you might be working with FWP staff or MSWP staff. So hopefully there won't be questions. That being said, given this especially is our first time around, I don't see why we couldn't ask some clarifying questions. We didn't actually discuss that, but we want to give each application, a fair shot. So I think that, if we were really stuck on something, that we would be reaching out to the contact person on the application and asking questions. I don't know if Stephanie or Dwayne, you have anything else to add there?
You did awesome, Deb.
Okay, next up, Dwayne, this is a good question for you potentially. Who in this process would be responsible for NEPA or MEPA documentation, threatened and endangered species review, impacts and permitting, mitigation for these projects?
Great question. So if we go back to, again, the two categories that I had, if I'm going to start with the non-MDT funded, so fully privately funded, that entity is going to be required to complete that process. All the permitting, all the mitigation, all that, it's going to be on them. If we move into the second category, the MDT funded process, MDT and or our consultant will work through that. We will resolve all that. We'll secure the funding. One thing to be clear though, just sorry, I'm an engineer, I'm crystal clear, I try to be anyways. Even on a non-MDT funded project, we will require a checklist as part of the encroachment permit. So because we are required to meet MEPA, even if we aren't funding it, we are required to meet MEPA. So we will require an environmental checklist that will have to be filled out by the applicant. I probably gave people more information than they wanted to know.
That was a good answer. Thanks.
All right, this is a question for Deb O'Neill. Are there opportunities for applications to be reviewed prior to their submission?
Again, I think by working closely with each of the agencies or MSWP, that will give you that review. If you talk to the subject matter experts and get help on the application, there won't be a formal review, but I think you'll get to where you need to go, and hopefully that'll answer your question. You'll get where you need to go by talking to our staff.
Okay, another question, perhaps for any of our panel members at this point, and if you need more clarification in the question, just let us know and the asker can maybe provide a little bit more clarification. But for feasibility studies, Dwayne, how would funding be allocated for like a biological observation study.
Wow. If it's required through the feasibility study, then it would have to be incorporated with that, and it would be funded through the feasibility study. I'm hoping that we're not looking at going out and doing a full-fledged research project, but obviously if we need to go gather additional data, that would be funded through the feasibility study.
Okay, and so that's through the feasibility study. Otherwise, that's part of, would you say, the data gathering activities that might be happening pre-application, right? Or some of the observational data or tracking data or something at that finer scale analysis that needs to be completed in order to really hone in on project location, challenge, solution, scope of the project.
That's
Etc.
exactly what I'd say, Deb.
Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Question for any of our panelists. Will projects that potentially benefit threatened and endangered species receive higher priority than those that do not?
I'm wondering if the criteria, is there something in the criteria, Stephanie, that says that? And also, obviously, the weighted planning tool helps with that as well, but
I don't believe, and I'd have to double check, I don't believe we have a specific call out for that sort of adding extra points. One thing folks might want to keep in mind is, especially if you're looking at potentially advancing a project that could then potentially compete for the new $350 million federal pilot program for wildlife accommodations, they have added an additional criteria that projects that support T&E species would rank higher. So it's certainly a consideration. I think we have been looking at more as what is the overall benefit, recognizing that a lot of the injuries that occur to humans on Montana roads are not with T&E species, and wanting to make sure that those are recognized sort of as equal importance, but also recognizing that there might be some projects that have less of a public safety impact, but do support a species that's either threatened or endangered or on the Montana list, that it would be worthwhile taking a harder look at that, since it would have that additional benefit.
Nice, good. Thanks, Stephanie. Maybe back to you, Dwayne. Is there a liability issue to the applicant if something were to happen during construction or the existence of a project that's been constructed by, I assume, those outside of, MDT?
It's kind of a very broad question, but I'll try to answer it the best I can. If MDT is constructing the project, and if we've moved forward with it, then most likely MDT is assuming the liability. However, if it's one of those non-MDT funded projects, or it's low complex project, and a private entity is out there in the roadway and causes a crash or an accident, they are going to bear that liability. That is part of the encroachment permit process. But ultimately, if we approve the project to be within our right of way and something happens later down the road, it's gonna, I'll just be honest, it's gonna be our liability whether we like it or not. And that's part of what we're willing to assume through this process.
Thanks, Dwayne. Another question for any of you three panelists. Are fish passage projects included within this process, or how has the committee treated those types of projects?
I'll throw out my 2 cents, and Deb can correct me, or Stephanie. This has predominantly been focused on land-based animals and wildlife. The planning tool was based on that. Most of the selection criteria is based on that. That's where our intent has been, is for wildlife vehicle collision reduction and improvement of connectivity of wildlife. But Deb, Stephanie, others chime in if I heard.
No, that's correct, Dwayne. This is for, increased human safety and wildlife accommodation, and these were for terrestrial species.
Okay, we have a couple more questions we can ask. Deb, maybe this one goes to you. So what if my project idea is not in an area of greatest need identified in the planning tool?
Good question, and I'll repeat what Dwayne has been saying. If I misspeak or if you guys have anything to add, please jump in. Um, so that's only one of the components of ranking a project. So it's a big part, but it's only one part. So it depends on, I think, what other applications we get in and how they're ranked. I wouldn't necessarily worry if it wasn't in the highest rated area. That's only, like I said, one of the criteria. It helps, but it won't kill it right away.
Great. Question for you, Stephanie. Why do lands need to be protected on either side of a project, especially if we're talking about a major infrastructure investment?
That's a great question. And I think it really goes back to this idea that a lot of these crossing structures, especially the larger ones, are a significant investment. And so making sure that we're using limited resources to put in crossings in places where they'll have long-term value. And in looking at land protections on either side, whether it's moving from public land or looking at private lands that have some sort of conservation easement, that creates a longer term insurance that species that are moving back and forth across that structure will be moving into lands that are suitable for them. I think the biggest concern, and I think an area where there's a lot of concern for folks in Montana, is seeing spaces where it would be great to put in a structure there, but the lands on either side are open to development. And so, is this space, especially if you're looking at a project, see this as an opportunity? Is this the space to do some of that longer term community work to see if you might be able to work with conservation groups or nonprofits to secure resources, to provide conservation easements for interested landowners, as well as other assurances? And I think it really depends on the size and scope of the project. If it's a smaller project, it might be okay if species are moving into an area that's not as well protected. But for these larger projects, we certainly don't want to, be funneling wildlife into an area where they could cause more conflict, and two, want to make sure that we're getting sort of the best bang for our buck for limited resources in Montana.
Very good, Stephanie. Thank you. Dwayne, this is a good question for you. Why aren't MDT or FWP just funding these types of projects?
Great question. And as we've talked about throughout this process, really the intent of this program is to build partnerships with NGOs, local governments, other entities, and truly turn this into a public-private partnership. And as Stephanie hit on, and Stephanie, I want to go back, that was I'm glad we're recording this. That was an awesome answer. Kind of back to what Stephanie was alluding to, we have limited resources. I wish we had the funding to go out and address all these issues. Keep in mind, we have 25,000 lane miles statewide. And while it seems like, $300, $400, $500 million is a lot of money, it doesn't go very far when you're maintaining roadways. So we need to find other funding sources to the benefit of wildlife and other features out there. So again, the program was built to be a public-private partnership.
Thanks, Dwayne. This is a question for any of you three. And I think it has to do with the planning tool score and how that's used in selection criteria for projects. And so the question is the statewide score or the relative district score from the planning tool used for ranking applications?
we're all playing chicken with our unmute button. Yes, it is incorporated into the scoring. It's just one of the many aspects that we're scoring within the application.
And I
Deb,
think the question was specific about, are you using the statewide score that the planning tool provides for a given highway segment, or are you looking at scores relative to other highway segments within MDT districts?
If I remember right, and Stephanie or Deb, correct me, we're going to use the score that's provided by the applicant based on the segment that they're applying for. We're not ranking it to other sites. We're using that value that's provided for their specific proposal. Is that answering the question?
No, not really. I'm wondering, I haven't played around with the planning tool in a while, so each segment has multiple scores. I mean, that's my, okay, so Stephanie's nodding, so maybe she could answer better.
Here's my answer, and I'm the least technical person on the, but I believe our goal with having it have sort of a statewide score, as well as the ability to then also look at it within a district, was to sort of be able to show some context, because I think we recognize that there are some parts of the state where there might be more collisions sort of based on number of people, population size, but we also wanted to acknowledge that there are some areas potentially where there may be less people, but there could be an important space. So I wouldn't really look at it as we're going to use just that score. And so, you could include both if it helps us get the picture that not only does this section have this score overall statewide, but this section scores this way compared to other projects in the Butte district. I think that only is additional information to help us understand. But I think it was us trying to really be able to show that different parts of the state potentially have different needs, but there is value in doing wildlife accommodations across all districts in Montana.
And Stephanie or Deb, remind me, I mean, part of doing the district-wide score was more for the biologists to kind of help assess their district, not so much for the application process, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I think it was because Eastern Montana didn't show up as anything compared to Western Montana in terms of important areas. So I think that's why we went to the district, and comparing within that district. Deb?
That's all correct. And I think Stephanie and Deb, you were saying similar things in that in the planning tool, right, there's a final analysis map in which all 5 criteria are rolled up into an overall score. There also is an individual score for each of the 5 criteria so that any applicant, anyone using the tool, can determine what is the driver, if you will, for that segment or those multiple segments of your area of interest. And again, remember, this is a very high level course level of data. So you're correct in the point that, I mean, actually Eastern Montana does light up based on a few of the individual criteria. And then Stephanie, I believe you had the best answer with regard to why we opted to include the districts, and that was to provide the tool and this program to be the most inclusive. We want to be supportive of good projects wherever they're proposed. So it's not a matter of ranking. This is not a priority map at all. This is just a map to help form partnerships, form coalitions, leverage resources, leverage funding, and focus on areas of need across our state. So then that's the importance of dropping down and developing more finer scale or mining more fine scale data to really determine what is the issue, what is the appropriate solution, what are your expected benefits, and really identifying specific locations and scopes for projects that are being proposed through the program. Fair? That sounds good. Okay, super. There's just a couple more, I think, and we're just at about 13 minutes before the hour or so. So Dwayne, why is MDT contributing $500,000 towards this annually? And do you expect that, how far do you expect that to go?
We used the way we came up with 500,000 was, basically we figured that would fund at least a couple of feasibility studies every year. We anticipate that continuing forward. One thing that we're trying to do is balance the needs, keeping in mind that, you know, it costs about $1 million to go replace a load posted timber bridge. And we have about 400 of those in the state right now. So this was an avenue that we thought we could reasonably sell to our Transportation Commission, as well as help seed the pot for these projects, get them through the feasibility study, build the prospectus to go help garner potential philanthropic funding, if at all possible.
Another question for you, Dwayne. Will these projects take years to deliver?
Yes. Next question. No. As I tried to explain during the implementation, our intent, our plan is, and where we're trying to go is using alternative contracting. Once we get the funding secured, our hope would be to use design build or CMGC and deliver these projects into construction within 18 to 24 months. We understand, especially if we're using private funds, private investors are not very patient. So our intent is to expedite these in the most reasonable, effective manner, while also keeping the cost down and get them out to construction as soon as we can. So again, our hope is 18 months once funding is secured.
Okay, looks like our questions have tailed off and some of our participants have had to drop off. So super job, everyone. Really well done. And thank you to all of our participants who joined us for this webinar. As was mentioned earlier, both of this webinar, the project program, and the webinar we did on Monday, which was about the planning tool, have been recorded and will be posted on our Montana Wildlife and Transportation Partnership website in the coming weeks. So thank you for joining us. Get out there and propose great projects, and we look forward to working with you on all of those in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.